Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Anton Warnchuk in Baltimore, and welcome to another edition of the Black Finance and Fraud Report. Now joining us is Bill Black. He's an associate professor of economics and law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, a white-collar criminologist, and a former financial regulator. Thanks for joining us, Bill. So let's get your take on the latest news that the French bank BNP Paribas has to pay a record $9 billion fine for U.S. sanctions violations.
So it's good news that there are actually tiny bits of criminal requirements in this case, that Paribas had to plead guilty. It was caught red-handed, not only having deliberately violated a host of sanctions, including on outright genocidal regimes that used the funding to kill their own citizens, but of then covering up those crimes, and indeed in covering up while they knew they were being investigated. They continued these felonies. The number, of course, is large, but insignificant relative to the size of the bank. It's being billed by the prosecutors here in the United States as, see, we proved that nobody's too big to jail, but of course, nobody's going to jail. Not because of the federal regulators, but because of the state regulator in New York, Mr. Losky. There is actually a requirement that 11 people lose their jobs, but they don't get prosecuted and they don't get their fraudulent proceeds clawed back. So crime still pays big time, even for those individuals. And of course, from the standpoint of the bank, the fines by definition can't be terribly significant relative to the size of the bank, because otherwise they might cause, quote unquote, the bank to fail. And it's clear that the federal regulators will never allow that to happen still. So it's a variant of the old story. There's still no prosecutions related to the crisis of any of the senior officers. This case has nothing to do with a financial crisis. But fortunately, because of the insistence of a New York regulator, there at least was the removal of some of the fraudulent officers from being in charge of the largest bank in France.
Okay, and how does this compare to the lawsuits or the settlements with HSBC and Credit Suisse?
So they are admitting at Paribas to having done things very similar to Standard Chartered, and there were no prosecutions in Standard Chartered's case, and the United States did not require any officers to even give back their money, much less sue them. And there were no prosecution at all, as I say, in Standard Chartered from the United States side. HSBC was in some ways even worse, in that for a decade it deliberately laundered money for one of the most violent drug cartels in the world. So they do have the blood of thousands of people on their hands, except of course corporations don't have hands. And the officers there were, again, not prosecuted, not sued individually, got to keep the proceeds that resulted from these frauds. So is this a good result? Of course not. It's maybe 1/8 of the way to where you should be, but compared to HSBC and Standard Chartered, it's a dramatic improvement. Does it indicate that the federal regulators have finally become regulators? No, they were still the problem. They're still the leading opponents of vigorous prosecutions, whereas we used to be the most vigorous proponents, supporters of prosecutions. Fortunately, in this particular case, we were saved by a state regulator who still believed that regulators ought to regulate.
Okay, Bill Black, thanks for that report.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.